RV, so I'm not sure that's going to happen. But that's what I heard podcast would make us back. So I've been planning to preach on this scripture for months. I knew that I was taking this weekend, and I knew it was landing on a potentially challenging week, end from a week. And it's a doozy to go with this week, I will say that, but I will also say, such is the Spirit, and so we'll get right to it. Okay, our verse comes from Matthew 5:10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So my first question coming into this short part of Jesus' sermon: who's righteous and who is doing the persecuting? How do I know who's the good guys and the bad guys in this story? Who's the winner? Who's the loser? These are my first questions. And it's a question that I didn't really realize was weighing on me for several weeks, actually, maybe even months, as our country made its way to this presidential election this week. Contentious, to say the least. And what an election forces you to do is choose sides, right? Like, how many people did you hear say, well, I'm choosing the lesser of two evils, like, but you got to choose, right? Like, you can't just vote for everyone, or, I mean, I guess you can vote for no one, but not recommended, but you could do that. So it forces us, if we plan to vote, to choose sides that in this case, sometimes it felt like they couldn't be further apart, or at least that's how our media feeds portrayed it to us, which may or may not be closely aligned with real life. But it just constantly asks us to know, who's righteous? Am I righteous, or are they righteous? Just fill in the blank for whatever the they is for you. I feel like I'm being persecuted for what I think, but my neighbor, who does not share my political sensibilities, also feels this, right? Also feels persecuted. If you listened to people on either side of the debate coming into this week, as far as I could tell, the only outcome was that we were going to be a fascist nation, because this side said, if that side wins, we're going to be fascist, and this side says, if that side wins, we're going to be fascist. So I was like, maybe we're just going to be fascists. Apparently, that's the only outcome, right? We need to know from this passage, which one of us is blessed, Jesus? Who is the blessed one? But I think, let's back up a minute. Let's look at this verse in context before we zero in on these words: persecuted, highly charged; righteous, also highly charged. Maybe we need a higher view to start. So the Bible Project team, they describe this passage as the Sermon on the Mount is the largest collection of Jesus' teachings. It's all about his good news that God's heavenly kingdom has touched down here on earth. And the Beatitudes that we're going through right now are just the introductory part of this sermon, right? Because it's 5 chapters long in our version of these collected stories of Jesus. And the Beatitude is just a short part of it. So we're just in the introduction, and this is the part where Jesus is identifying his listeners, his audience. And this is a smart rhetorical strategy, right? If you want to make a convincing argument, you need to know who you're talking to, right? So when you are talking to your neighbor who shares your political sensibilities, you probably say things in one way. And if you talk to your neighbor who doesn't, you probably talked about it in a different way. And that's rhetorical wisdom, one might say. So we need to know, who's Jesus talking to? Our verse 10 comes in the third part of the introduction. So the first 3 described who is part of the kingdom. And the next 3 described who's comfortable in this kingdom And the third section, which is where we are, we're in the middle of the third section with verse 10, is about why this path of living is difficult. And the Bible Project team uses, instead of the phrase, blessed are the humble, or blessed are the meek, or blessed are the persecuted, they say the good life. They say, how good is life for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. How good is life? And I don't know, does that remind you of a state motto? It's the good life, right? And these Beatitudes were Jesus' way of reminding the disciples, and now us, to look around and see that God is already at work. And that work may be happening in unexpected ways, or in people who don't look or act like you or me. The crowds that followed Jesus in this early part of his ministry, they were chasing hope because they had no hope, right? They were chasing healing because they were sick or diseased. They were people looking for a new world order because the one they were living in was obviously not working for them. People whose lives were okay and everything was working, and they were like, yeah, I've heard somebody say something about that, but they didn't need it. These people who were gathering around Jesus, they didn't have anything else. They were coming because they needed it. And so here's Jesus now looking around and saying, here's the people who are blessed. And so this could sound, I think, maybe condescending a little bit, or maybe a little obtuse, because these are the poor, the sick, the needy, and Jesus is like, no, you don't understand, you're blessed. It's not about you not having food or being super sick and not being able to have a job. You're fine, you're blessed, right? But it's not like that. It's not that, even though it's like, what's happening here? Jesus isn't offering wishful thinking or fake positivity, like it's fine. He's prophesying a good future and a present reality, a new way of seeing and acting. So N.T. Wright says, this is good news, not good advice. This is good news. You who are sitting right in front of me right now. He was telling them how to be. He was identifying how they were saying it was and what they were feeling. It was going to be okay. But when? I feel like they had to have been saying, Jesus. When? I heard you healed that guy. That's why I came. That's what I'm looking for. But Jesus at this point is kind of far away, just telling them, you're okay. You're blessed. You're good. I feel brokenhearted. I don't know why I'm crying. When will I be comforted? When will I be satisfied with righteousness? When will I experience the good life? Thank you. So here's, this is from N.T. Wright's Matthew for Everyone. Coming in the next chapter, the prayer Jesus taught his followers is that we are to pray that God's kingdom will come and God's will be done on earth. All of you sitting in front of me, Jesus is saying, as it is in heaven. And the life of heaven, the life of the realm where God is already king, is to become the life of the world, transforming the present earth into the place of beauty and delight that God always intended. And those who follow Jesus are to begin to live by this rule here and now. That's the point of the Sermon on the Mount and these Beatitudes in particular. They're a summons to live in the present in the way that will make sense in God's promised future. because the future has arrived in the present in Jesus. He knew it and felt it. It may seem upside down, but we're called to believe with great daring that it is, in fact, the right way up. And so I want to look at a couple of other ways to translate this particular verse that might help us dig deeper. A little blurry, but just from my Bible app. But that first one, which is nice for November, is from the First Nations version. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's very challengingly different, but it was translated by a group of Native American people from all different tribes who came together to make this translation. They have this translation of the New Testament. Creator's blessing rests on the ones who are hunted down and mistreated for doing what is right, for they are walking the good road above. Happy are people whose lives are harassed because they're righteous, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. And you're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. The persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom. So you get the idea that Jesus, right before this, and what Matt was talked about last week, talks about peacemakers, which at first sounds calming. Peacemakers. Until you really think about it and realize that you don't need a peacemaker if everything's going okay. You kind of only need the peacemaker if you're in the middle of a war, right? Or two people are just really not getting along, and what happens usually for the peacemaker is that neither side is totally on board with the peacemaker. The neutral party is usually not seen as the friend because they're trying to make concessions on both sides, right? They're trying to, my kids say this is my great flaw, my great weakness. And they're probably right, because I'm the mom who, when they come and say, my teacher, this, and this, I say, but you know how hard it is to teach 16-year-olds financial literacy? It's very hard, right? My friend, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, yeah, I know. But do you know how hard it is to be, My mom says my grandma was always famous for saying, they must have had a hard childhood when they would complain about one of their friends. And they would be like, I don't want to have compassion in this moment. I want to have rage. Right? So this is the peacemakers. They usually take shots from all sides, even as they try to make peace. And then he follows that with this verse about persecution and righteousness. And so by now, I'm not sure I've been asking the right question when I want to know who is righteous and who is persecuted. Maybe I should be looking at different kinds of things. And a quick story that totally highlighted this for me, in just my own reading this morning, the lectionary for today is Mark 12, 38 through 44. And it's the story of the widow's mite. You know the story of the widow's mite. But that's in like verse 43 and 44. In verses like 38 through 40, the verses are about scribes and how they're wearing their robes, their fancy robes, and they're saying all these prayers. But they are, and this is straight from the scripture that I'd never really noticed in this position before, stealing the homes of the widows. And then then the very next story is, and everyone was coming to the synagogue where the scribes have a fancy place to sit, and the widow came and she gave everything. And I think I have always been very tempted to sentimentalize this widow as an all-good fairy godmother type who just was, she didn't have very much in life, but she didn't care. But when the passage right before is the scribes were stealing, the concept is maybe that they were, the scribes were the people who could read and write, and so they were in charge of things like passing down inheritance and things like that, and that they were known for sometimes skimming off of that and leaving a widow with nothing. And then the story. So I'm tempted to sentimentalize the poor, the disenfranchised, the weak, the ones who are not in places of power. And for sure in that story, Jesus says the widow did the good thing. She gave everything. When they were giving out of their wealth, she was giving everything that she had. But he doesn't say, as I would like to say, so let's give her all the extra so she can go have a good life and be rich like them. That's how the Disney story would end, rags to riches, right? That's how the princess movie would end. But instead, it's like Jesus was like, she did the right thing. And I realized when I was reading that today, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's just about doing the right thing no matter who you are. If you're the person who doesn't have everything, or you're the person who has everything, if you're the person who's being left out, or you're the person who's right in the middle of the action, it's just about doing the right thing. That's what matters to Jesus. That's what matters to Jesus, and he's a peacemaker. So one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite writers is every time you draw a line in the sand, Jesus is always going to be on the other side. Even when you know he's with you, he's also on the other side of your line. And this is what I love and am made crazy by about Jesus, right? Because I want to win, right? I want to, even more than winning, because I am the person. This is another of my flaws. Welcome to Felicity's Flaw Sunday. This is another of my flaws. I love sports. I'm just a nut about sports. Like, I'm kind of hoping I can get out of here a little bit early because there's a game starting at 11 that I want to see most of. But as soon as somebody wins and somebody else loses, I'm like, cut the feed. I do not want to see the crying men. I cannot handle seeing the losing team cry. I can't handle it. Am I glad I won? Yes, but I do not want to be that person. I long ago, you know the movie Hoosiers? Are you guys please be Hoosiers fans? Okay, I love the movie Hoosiers. I grew up in a small town, so I was Hickory, right? I was the Hoosiers, and we beat the big bad team, you know? Then I moved to Omaha, I moved to Midtown, my kids started going to Central, and one day I looked around and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm the other team. I'm the team that was the huge state school that got beat in the finals, and they're crying on the ground. And when I kind of realized this, that almost the exact thing had happened to us, except we have classes here, so we were both big schools, but it was still very sad, and we were crying. And I was like, I am both sides of that story. And I think that that's important to remember all the time, is that we are both sides of this story. So think about what Jesus always got in trouble for. What were the main reasons he was persecuted? Go ahead, Claire. Religion and politics, right? And these are the two things we're reminded not to discuss in social situations because they so quickly cause contention. And this has been true for a very long time, not just in the last 4, 8, 12, 16 years, right? It's been true for a very long time. People maybe were better at doing it than we are now, but for sure, it's been true for a very long time. Don't talk about these two things because it gets people heated up, but think about it. Jesus annoyed Jewish leaders, established a religion, because he was not the best at taking their laws seriously. That's at best. He just didn't take it seriously. At worst, he was a heretic, right? I mean, in the end, that's why he was crucified, is because they did not like that he kept saying he was God, right? That went way too far for religious sensibilities. He was healing on the Sabbath, and when challenged, he claimed that he could do so because he was sent from God. He messed with religious structures. Then, because he also talked about kingdoms and rulers and God, who the Romans saw their Caesar as God, their ruler as God, he was also a threat to the political establishment. He couldn't be pinned down. Everyone who tried to catch him as in an entrenched idea was fooled. He wanted more than religious rules and proclamations could provide. And he wanted more than political promises and platforms could offer. He wanted a new thing, a new kingdom. And this is good news, but it's kind of hard to understand in a culture that prioritizes winning and strength and power. And these are generally our hallmarks for who is right, who has the power, who won. Right? This is what we usually think about. But Jesus says here that the news is better than we thought. It's better than just winners and losers. And we have to be willing to think outside of or beyond what we expect or have possibly believed. Maybe one of my favorite declarations from Jesus is that we have to come to his new ideas like a child, open and curious. I just thought of that video you showed me. Dan, you guys are probably all like this too. You sometimes just sit around and you're on your phone and you just show each other funny things. Okay, yeah. He didn't show me this one, but it was like a kindergarten graduation, and the dad is watching it, and the little girl walks up and she goes, "I want to be pregnant." And the dad was like, "Oh no." I was just thinking of how the news is like a child. What I want us to do is think like a kid. Like, she didn't have all the political or social or even religious ramifications of what that meant to her. She just wanted to be a mom, right? She didn't know. She was just a kid. She came to it like a kid. So to do that today, I want to wrap up this idea with some different language. And I want to read this Beatitudes passage for you from this children's Bible. It's pretty new, called the Book of Belonging. It was created by a couple of moms who were inspired by the always difficult questions they got from their kids, right? And kids who were not afraid to ask very non-religious questions about biblical passages, right, that really make you think. And I think it's a good way to shake off some maybe stubborn religiosity, old patterns of thinking. It's kind of just a beautiful passage. So I'm just going to read that, and then we will pray to close. So they call it the outside-in kingdom. Jesus became quite famous, not in the worldwide way you might think of, but in the way of small towns and irrepressible goodness, the way the best bakery in the valley becomes famous, the way the most beautiful sunrise view in the foothills becomes famous. People could not help but bubble over with the good news of what Jesus was doing. At the wells, in the marketplace, through the vineyards, and under the stars, stories and whispers flew. Have you heard about this new teacher? He says God's kingdom is here. Little old Jerusalem, little old Nazareth. He cures illnesses. He performs miracles. And people began to flock to Jesus like birds riding a warm wind. They brought him their sick friends to be healed. They waited to hear his teaching. They repented. They returned to God and believed in their true names. Crowds covered the hillsides where he stayed, made up of all kinds of different people: the sick, the scandalous, the poor, the pagan, the pious. People who would never, ever be seen together found themselves drawn to the same place for the same reason: Jesus. And one particular day, the disciples were looking at the crowd, and Jesus was looking at the disciples, and he saw their eyes jumping from person to person, naming them in their minds: nobodies, mess-ups, heathens, failures, rule breakers, outsiders. Jesus sighed. We all know that it's hard to remember or believe who God says you are when other people are always calling you something different. And this is why words and names are so important. Some of the stickiest names are the ones that convince us we don't belong with God. Names that really just mean outsider. But Jesus knew that in God's dream, nobody is treated as an outsider. God had always been telling God's people to trust God's name for them first, to invite others in, to care for the forgotten and give them new names like belonging, beloved, delightful. And God made people to be like little mirrors, to reflect what God is like and to act like God in the world. And now Jesus would remind them about the lives for which they were made. God's kingdom was spilling in, but it was going to look so much different than even Jesus' closest friends expected. So Jesus smiled and spoke gently to those friends, showing them how things were going to be. See these people? Their spirits are begging. He said, gesturing to the ragtag crowd, and God is for them. God is for the sad and the gentle and the searching. They see God's kingdom in new ways. And Jesus' friends looked out across the hills, dotted with people eager for a taste of heaven on earth. People they were warned about, people they avoided, people they pitied. Was Jesus really saying that there was goodness there? That God's blessing was on these people? Jesus went on. God is for the merciful, the honest, the peacemakers. Yes, they're all in this crowd, and they all give us glimpses of God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus knew this lesson wouldn't be an easy lesson. Habits are hard to break, and God's people had many ideas about belonging, about who was in and who was out. Jesus' new way of thinking would divide people and create arguments. This comes to our verse. God is for you when others insult and reject you for acting like me, but you're supposed to light up the world. Jesus reminded them, the way you act should show others God's love for them. And the disciples listened closely as Jesus continued to paint a beautiful and startling picture of what God's dream for God's people looked like. Some of it was familiar and some of it was brand new. Remember the mountain of God when Moses told you how to love God and one another well? Watch me. I'll show you how to do that. And Jesus spoke for a long time with lesson after lesson, new ways to live, a new type of kingdom. But when the people listening wondered, this hard and holy way of living that Jesus described sounded beautiful, true, and good. They wanted to live like that. But as they looked at the world around them, war and suffering and sickness and tears, it seemed unlikely, impossible. Will there be an instant fix? How will things change? Is Jesus going to destroy the Roman power machine? No, Jesus told them in his mysterious way. This is not like the violent clashes and conquests throughout history. God's kingdom is here, but also not here. So Jesus wove together some word pictures, hoping to help them understand God's kingdom is spilling in bit by bit. He tried to show them it's already here and it's almost arrived. It's a kingdom of already and almost. It's like a tiny mustard seed that is planted and will grow to cover the hillsides. It's like a bit of yeast in a batch of dough that changes the way the dough looks and expands. It's like a net thrown into the water that catches fish of every kind. Things have changed and will continue to change. You're getting peeks and glimpses of what will someday be everywhere. And then that book includes like questions like, more questions than answers is what it offers, which I think is pretty great. So on the next slide, today's closing prayer is not so much that we be able to identify who is righteous or who is persecuted, since these issues are part of the kingdom that is both here and not here yet, coming and yet available now. Our prayer is that we begin to identify the ways of this kingdom and be willing to let it challenge our own. Be curious enough about others to, that should say, imagine the world from their perspective. Be brave enough to stand for right relationships, sometimes how righteousness is translated, even when it forces us to abandon our tribes or traditions. People over politics, relationships over religion, the way of love. And all of this, it's easy to preach when your side wins. It's not easy to preach when your side doesn't win, right? When you're not the winner. It's very easy to be sportsmanlike when you won by 20. It's very hard to be sportsmanlike when you lose. Maybe more even, especially when you lose by 1 or 2 or something, right? It's so hard. But I think that this is what Jesus is reiterating here, is that you're blessed when you're persecuted for being righteous, when you're in right relationship, outside of tribes and outside of groups, in groups and out groups. You just do the right thing every time to the person who's right in front of you, whoever that person is. And it's very easy to do it when you like that person. It's very hard to do when you don't like that person. But Jesus was like, it's for both people. That's why the Beatitudes are so hard and so easy, right? And so like him, which is what I love. So let's pray. God, we thank you for your word, for these stories and glimpses into the life of